How do you solve quadratic equations that don't look like quadratic equations? Well, you can use a method called substitution. All right, here's the example that we'll be doing in this video. We need to solve for x in this equation, and we need to do it by putting this equation into quadratic form. Now, if you remember solving for x in quadratic equations, you might know that a quadratic equation looks like ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Now, if you're not quite familiar with solving quadratic equations, I do have a video on it that you can watch on the card on the screen right now. So you can go watch that and then come back here. But just as a quick review, a quadratic equation always has an x squared part, a regular just x part, and then some number by itself. And then that equals 0. But in this equation, we don't have that. We have an x to the fourth, an x squared, and then a number by itself. So it's kind of similar, but we have bigger exponents. So the only way for us to be able to solve this is to somehow turn this equation into this format. How would we do that? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new variable. And just to make sure we understand, this does say x here, but it doesn't technically have to be the letter x. It can be any letter of the alphabet. It doesn't matter. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new letter instead of x, and we're going to try to get it into this format. And we're going to use the letter U. If you're not sure why we're using the letter U, I don't know either. It's like a calculus thing or something. You don't have to worry about that. But you could use any letter you want. If you wanted to use Z or F, I don't know. You can use what you want. So what we're going to do is we're going to replace these x's with U, and we're going to set U equal to something. But if you want a fast way to figure out what we need to make U, all you have to do is take the x part that's in the middle of our equation. Obviously, this is assuming that your equation is in order. So like if you had the 12 by itself at the beginning and the x to the fourth in the middle and so on, you'd have to rearrange the equation around from biggest exponent all the way down to smallest exponent. So let me show you what happens when we set u equal to x squared. This means that whenever we have x squared, it turns into u. So for example, here we have minus 4x squared. We're now going to have minus 4 times u. This minus 12 is going to stay the same, and so is the equal 0. But what is this x to the fourth going to become? Well, x to the fourth is the same thing as x squared squared, because x squared is x times x, and then you do another 2 x's, you have 4 x's. And x squared in this case is u. So this is going to become u squared. And if you weren't sure if you did it right, you could always reverse it. So you can turn u into x squared, that's x times x, times x, which is x to the fourth. So you'll see now that we've replaced everything with u's, it looks like a quadratic equation now. We have a squared part, we have just the letter by itself part, and then we have a number by itself with no letter. So we can solve this just like a normal quadratic equation. You can solve this basically using whatever method you want. What I usually do is I try to see if I can solve it using factoring, because that's the easiest and the quickest. And if I can't solve it using factoring, then I use the quadratic formula because it works every time. So let's see if we can factor this. We need to find two numbers that add up to -4 and multiply to get -12. So let's go ahead and figure out what numbers multiply to -12. Well, first of all, if we're ignoring the minus sign for now, we have 12 times 1. That makes 12. And because it's negative, we have to figure out which one of these is negative. It's going to add up to a negative number, which means the bigger number is the one that needs to be negative. Because if we had put the negative sign on the smaller number, then if we add these up, we're going to get a positive number, and we're trying to get -4. So -12 times 1 make -12, and if we add them together, we get -11. We're looking for -4. That's not what we're looking for, so that's out the window. But you can also get 12 by multiplying 6 and 2. And remember, we're trying to add up to a negative number, so we're going to make the 6 negative because it's bigger than 2. And if we add these together, then we get -6 plus 2, which is -4. And that is the number we're looking for. See, -4. So our two numbers are -6 and 2. So what we're going to do is we're going to put it into our factored format, which is 2 sets of parentheses equals 0. And normally we put x plus something or x minus something, but remember, we're not using x in this case, we're using u. So we're going to put u on both of these, and then we're going to insert our numbers. So -6 was one of them we got, and we also got +2, so +2. And now we're just going to solve this just like normal. So we can split this up into two equations because it equals 0, and if either of these are 0, the whole thing is 0, because anything times 0 is 0. So this is going to become u minus 6 equals 0, and u plus 2 equals 0. And now we just need to solve for u. So on this side, we're going to have u minus 6. We need to do the opposite of minus, which is plus, to get u by itself. And we'll just be left with u equals 0 plus 6, which is 6. And now we do the same thing over here, but we have a plus 2. We have to do the opposite of plus, which is minus. So we'll subtract 2 from both sides. These cancel, and we'll just be left with u equals 0 minus 2, which is minus 2. So we've solved for u, but remember that the goal of the problem was to solve for x. Because u wasn't actually a letter in this problem, saying what u equals isn't very helpful. So because we needed to solve for x, we need to turn the u's back into x. And remember that u is equal to x squared. So our u's are going to turn into x squared. So instead of u equals 6, we're now going to have x squared equals 6. And over here, we had u equals minus 2. Now we have x squared equals minus 2. And now we just need to solve for x. So over here on this side, we have x squared. To get x by itself, we have to get rid of the squared. So we'll do the opposite of squared, which is square rooting. But remember that when you square root both sides of an equation, what you're really doing is plus or minus square rooting. So the squared and the square root cancel, and you're just left with x equals plus or minus the square root of 6. Well, the square root of 6 is not a nice even number, so you can actually just leave it as that, plus or minus the square root of 6. So this is your final answer on this side. And remember, this is actually two answers. It's the positive the square root of 6 and minus the square root of 6. And we're also going to get two answers over here. So there's going to be 4 total answers, which makes sense because the biggest exponent here is 4. And over here, we'll do the same thing. We get rid of the squared by square rooting both sides. And remember that it's plus or minus square rooting. The squared and the square root cancel, and we just have plus or minus the square root of negative 2. Well, you can't take the square root of a negative number, right? But we can use imaginary numbers to do this. So we'll split this up into the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 2. Because negative 1 times 2 is negative 2. The square root of 2 is a real number, and that'll just stay as it is. And the square root of negative 1 is the letter I. So we're going to be left with plus or minus I times the square root of 2. Or you could have written that the other way around, plus or minus the square root of 2i. Either one is fine. So there you go. Now you know how to solve other weird polynomials by just putting them into a quadratic equation and then solving it like a quadratic equation. But remember that u isn't always going to be x squared. Sometimes it'll be x to the third or x to the fourth. So just make sure you take that middle number and use that to figure out what u is. But that's solving quadratic equations. What about how to graph them? That's also often struggled with in algebra. So if you want to learn how to do that, you can watch this video right here. And as always, if you have any questions about this video, go ahead and leave it in the comments and I'll be sure to answer your question. Thanks for watching.